This morning we want to look at the first epistle or letter of John. And this class is going to be focused on introducing the letter, getting a little flavor of the letter, getting some sense of where to anchor the letter in history so that we can, as we listen to half of a telephone conversation, have some idea of the context in which we find ourselves. And John is a bit of an unfamiliar place for most of us because he has a way of thinking that is very different than the context in which we find ourselves. Most of the scholars, even to this day, consider this probably to be written by the person who wrote the Gospel of John. And there are many similar themes. One of the themes that you'll identify with is the theme of light and darkness. I brought with me today the collect for the first Sunday in Advent that probably is known to you in the Anglican liturgical calendar. The first Sunday of Advent, usually the end of November, the very beginning of December. Almighty God, give us grace that we may cast away the works of darkness and put upon us the armor of light. This kind of light and darkness idea is a big theme all the way through John, Revelation, the Gospel of John. So if you remember the Gospel of John, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it or overcome it. You get that kind of language, light and darkness back and forth, contrast between the other world and this world, being born from above, being from down here, being born again. Lots of dualities, lots of contrasts between things that seem to be sandwiched together in order to accentuate the idea of the difference between the two as you think of them both at the same time. It's a very different way of thinking than most of us are used to. If I walked up to you and said, yes, no, you'd look at me and sort of like I was seemingly odd. But the way John works, that's very much a part of his thinking. So I want you to think of this as something probably written by John. And the John with whom we have to do was an eyewitness of the person and ministry of Jesus. And the words have a strong resemblance to the Gospel of John in numerous ways. So we're in this sort of Johannine world, but we're later than the Gospel. So in terms of time, we want to be probably in the 80 to 90 AD kind of area. So if you think of Jesus born in something like 4 BC, 33 AD to 29 to 33 AD to the time of his death. So let's just put it at 30 AD. So Jesus dies something like 30 AD. You're talking about essentially a full generation and maybe a little bit more than that after Jesus. So you've got the early church having been launched. You've got lots of apostolic communities out there. And one of the difficult questions about this letter is, to whom is it written? You get these lovely descriptions of his audience, children, brethren, and one of John's favorite words, beloved. So he clearly has a great intimate knowledge of and warm tenderness toward his readers. But who are these people? It's the early church for sure. But what kind of early church is it? Probably Jewish and Gentile congregations dispersed throughout sort of the broad reach of Asia Minor, roughly second generation, late first generation Christian communities. And they're spread in a kind of a Christian diaspora in various places. You can think about the missionary journeys in the book of Acts. And so John's got these communities about which he's concerned. And he's been hearing things, and he has his own concerns about the church, so he's writing to them as if they sat at his feet, because he feels like, in a sense, they're one generation removed from him. Just like he sat under Jesus' feet, they sat under his feet, and the people who sat under his feet are now starting to grow up and have children and disciple their own children. So he's writing to these communities, and he's got some real love, he's got some real affection. Think about the way that you might write, for example, to your own godchildren or your own grandchildren. That's very much the feel of the epistle of 1 John. And he's got concerns. There are things that he wants to make sure go right. There are things that he's concerned that are going wrong that need to be corrected. And so he's writing this kind of as a tender, almost spiritual grandfather type of person, or spiritual godfather. And he's trying to encourage these Christian communities to be more of who Christ calls them to be. So you with me so far? Probably John the Apostle, probably AD 80 to 90, probably dispersed early Jewish and Christian communities, late first generation, early second generation. Now, let me say a word about the concerns that John has, because whenever you read a letter or a gospel, they have different textures, they have different concerns, they have different focuses. Probably the most important line of John, I think I will read it to you, in terms of the purpose of the letter is in chapter 5. And let me read you verse 13, because it's very much in John's mind all through this epistle. I write this to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life. Something isn't right in this community, and one of the things that isn't right is they lack Christian assurance. They lack Christian confidence. They've been told that they're Christians. Some of the people around them claim to be Christians. They're now second generation. It's a little bit harder to own it if it's second generation. You weren't there at the beginning. The novelty is worn off. You haven't heard as if you've seen it yourself. You're hearing from somebody who did see it, who's passing it on to you. And so there's clearly a problem of confidence and assurance that's very much in John's mind. And right behind that is, I would say, a passionate desire to make sure that they avoid falsely understanding their faith and they make sure to truly understand their faith. This is one of the earliest examples in the New Testament where you begin to get a real sense of heresy developing in the church. There's clearly something off in the community. There's false teaching, there's false teachers in the Christian community, and John is very concerned that people who are Christians don't get persuaded to understand their faith or think of it in the wrong way. And what is one of the phrases that scholars use to describe this heresy, it has a particular name, and it really doesn't become fully flowered in the form in which John's wrestling with it until the 2nd century, but it's a form of what the scholars call Docetism, and it's important that we understand this before we even delve into the letter. Docetism comes from the Greek word dokeo, which means literally in English to seem. And the idea comes from a clash between the ancient Greek worldview and the worldview that Jesus would have, a more Judaic worldview. And in the Greek worldview, flesh and spirit were very much opposed. So the idea of something from the spirit world coming into the fleshly world is completely out of whack, because in Greek thinking, the spirit world is good and the fleshly world is bad. So you've got this collision. And so one of the ways that it becomes a difficulty in the context of that kind of cultural understanding is you somehow try to make the incarnation, right, which, I mean, because we believe, to quote John's Gospel, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, right? John's Gospel, chapter 1, verses 14 to 16. I mean, a very dramatic statement, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. That's a very affirming statement, not simply about the world from which Jesus came, but the world into which Jesus came. And the world became flesh to a Greek person. It's just like, no, not became flesh. They might have coasted on flesh or partly engaged with flesh or something like that. But flesh is evil, and the word is coming from the spirit world, which is good. And you can see the problem that would be there if somebody were coming from a Greek world and trying to understand the Christian worldview, particularly in the area of the incarnation. And so what happened is people tried to find a way to understand the reality of Jesus as the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah. The Word became flesh, which both honored the language of the Christian faith that they were being taught and the Greek worldview in which they had grown up or which had infected their thinking because of the place in which they found themselves culturally and historically. And so you would hear people in the community say things like, for example, well, yes, the Word became flesh, but what that actually means is Jesus didn't really become flesh. I should say become flesh. It seemed like he became flesh. And there, of course, is the key idea of that word dokeo, which is the word from which we get the word Docetism, which is the heresy. See, Jesus seemed to be human. He seemed to have come into the flesh. But to seem to do something and to actually do it, as you well know, talk to any actor, they're not the same, right? I mean, an actor, if they're really good, can make you think that you're actually engaging with real life, but it's part of a suspension of disbelief that you engage whenever you go to the theater, that they get you into that. Well, this is way beyond that, right? This is, no, Jesus is getting me to think he's human, but it's only because he seems that way. And the reason they're doing this is because they somehow don't want this full collision between the spirit world and the fleshly world. So if Jesus seems to be human but not completely human, then that will find a way to talk about the language of light and darkness and the Word becoming flesh, but not dishonor the cultural context when they find themselves. And so you get language like that and you get ideas like that, and John doesn't like that. John is very concerned in this letter to say, make sure that you understand that Jesus really came, that Jesus really is the Christ, not seeming like the Christ, not appearing like the Christ, not playing a role like the Christ, but really is the Christ. So when he says that you may believe, that's not simply a problem of assurance, it's also a problem of accuracy and truth and genuineness, if I can use that language. Another idea that was the kind of thing that you might find is the divine Christ came upon the human Jesus at his baptism and left him at the cross. That's another one of the ideas that might have been running around at this time. So you get this, so you get this very sort of fleshly Jesus, and then the divine kind of comes and hops on at one point, and then kind of hops off at another point. And again, you just don't get a full incarnation. You don't get Jesus being both 100% God and 100% man at the same time. And John will have none of it. This is Antichrist, he will say. Be careful, because there's false teachers and there's false teaching running around. And let me just say, before we go any farther, that this is important in terms of your awareness as a Christian in the church. John is writing to a Christian community. This is not false teaching that's coming way outside the church, as if, somebody like Richard Dawkins in our time, who's a kind of a famous atheist, is sort of showing up and saying, you shouldn't believe in God at all. He's clearly outside the church, and he's coming into the church and trying to challenge the church in a kind of a public way. That's an important challenge, but it's much more explicit. This is more devious and more subtle. These are people who are inside the church, in leadership in the church, and they're taking people away from Christ because they're trying, but they're not getting it right. Here's an amazing section of this letter that a lot of people don't often notice. Verse 19 of the 2nd chapter. They went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out, that it might be plain that they are not of us. Now that's a remarkable statement if you actually give it time to kind of sit there and let it settle. And it ought to make you really uneasy if you're sitting in a Christian community, because what it means is clearly there are people who were claiming the name of Christ, who were in the Christian community, who had some leadership and some influence, who are teaching things that sound plausible, who are in positions that should have authority, and yet they're teaching the wrong thing. So you got to get John's ideas in your heart as a pastor. It's not simply that the Christians to whom he's writing lack confidence. It's also that they lack enough of an ability to discern truth from error. This is an epistle that deals with the very challenging idea of false teaching in and through the church, and the subtlety of the challenge to discern things rightly. Let me say one more thing by way of introduction before I go on, and that has to do with style. I've talked about the writer and the time and some of the sense of purpose of the letter. Let me also say one more thing, which is just a sense of the style. And this is important because John's style just isn't like the way that most of us think. One of the ways I sometimes teach John is I say to people, it's like a fly flying around a light bulb. And it really is. I mean, John has a very circular style, and it can be either aggravating or actually kind of liberating and wonderful if you get an image. But you'll be reading John, and he'll go this way around the light bulb, and then that way around the light bulb, and then this way, and he'll say the same thing, and it'll seem very similar 3 different times, but actually they're slightly different, but it's the same. And you say, John, why are you being so repetitious? But for John, that kind of circular reasoning is very much a way of reassuring and reinforcing to his community a sense of the truth. I brought with me this morning Calvin's introductory comments about the Epistle of John, which I absolutely love, because I think it speaks to this image of the style. Listen to what Calvin says. This is one of the greatest scholars in the history of Christianity writing about this epistle. This epistle is altogether worthy of the spirit of that disciple who, above others, was loved by Christ. That's John's description. The one whom Jesus loved, the apostle whom Jesus loved, the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's the way John describes himself in his own gospel, that he might exhibit him as a friend to us. But it contains doctrines mixed with exhortations. For he speaks of the eternal deity of Christ, and at the same time of the incomparable grace which he brought with him when he appeared in the world, and generally of his blessings. And he especially commends and extols the inestimable grace of divine adoption. There's a great phrase that's preachable. The inestimable grace of divine adoption. Now here Calvin goes on. On these truths he grounds exhortations, and at one time he admonishes us in general to lead a pious and holy life, and in another time he expressly enjoins love. But he does none of these things in a regular order. Can I just read that to you again? John Calvin is my kind of guy. He's a left hemisphere guy. He's scientific, analytic, right? A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. And he's being honest about John's way of thinking, basically saying it's not the way he's used to thinking, right? So not in a regular order, right? Because flies that go around a light bulb are not doing A, B, C. For he everywhere mixes teaching with exhortation. But he particularly urges brotherly love. He also briefly touches on other things, such as to beware of impostors and similar things. But each particular shall be noticed in its own place. I thought that was a particularly insightful 2 paragraphs from Calvin, just to give you a feel. So don't get annoyed if it feels like it may be a little repetitious from your perspective, or maybe a little unfamiliar stylistically from your perspective. All right, one last thing, and then I think we'll stop for the purposes of our introduction. That is just, I thought I'd start just with the beginning of the epistle. Here's John writing, and he's got these concerns. He's got these communities for which he feels, I think, an apostolic responsibility, a grandfatherly responsibility. I mean, think about a good grandfather, a good grandmother. They have a concern for their grandchildren as people, really, above all things. I mean, that's the nice thing about grandparents, is they care about your sort of future as a member of the family, as a citizen of the world, and Lord willing, if they're Christians, as a citizen of the next world. And where would you start? It's an interesting question. If I've given you all this introduction and you're John, you start writing, where would you start? What's really moving to me, I think, and it ought to be moving to you, is what John chooses to do at the start. I mean, here is this person who's lived at Jesus' feet, experienced the unprecedented ministry of Jesus for 3 years, an eyewitness of the resurrection of Jesus. And what does he say at the beginning of this letter? Listen to the language. I'm reading from the Revised Standard Version. These are the first 4 verses. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and touched with our hands, concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we saw it and testified to it and proclaimed to you the eternal life which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you may have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ. And we are writing this, that our joy may be complete. So you got lots of John's circular style already in those first 4 verses. But what I want you to notice is John's passionate concern to begin this by saying this, just this simply. I saw it, I heard it, I felt it, I touched it, I smelled it. It really happened. And you ought to be moved by that, because it's a grandfather, as it were, almost writing about a birth. You know, a generation and a half or 2 generations later, he's trying to remind himself of the fact he was there. He's writing to an early 2nd generation church and saying, I was there when the church was birthed. You know, I saw the womb. I saw the baby. I saw the birth process. I saw it. I felt it. I touched it. It was an irrevocable memory for me, and it was a historical fact that I experienced. And I don't want you to be in any way unclear before I start writing about my other pastoral concerns, that what we're dealing with is historical faith. There's a lovely section in C.S. Lewis's life where one of his friends, who's an atheist, is drunk by the fire one night, and he says something which haunts Lewis and eventually is one of the many pieces that leads to Lewis's conversion. To quote Lewis's own words about what he said, this is a man in a drunken stupor who's an atheist. He said, it's a rum thing, that story about the dying God. It seems to have really happened once. It haunted him. John's very concerned at the outset to say, hey, this really happened. Now, let me stop there and ask two questions at a kind of a practical level, and then we'll be done for the first class. The first thing I want to do is I want to challenge you in the area of true and false teaching. This ought to bother you, but it also ought to challenge you, and it also ought to make you think. I sometimes think about medicine when I think about these things. When you deal with medicine, people who do good medicine know not only what good medicine is, but they know that if you do the wrong things, if you put the wrong things into your body, it will have bad consequences for health. So good medicine is not simply promoting health, it's also fighting disease. It's fighting bad diets, bad drugs, bad intake, bad bodily care. And nobody who's practicing good medicine can do one or the other. You have to do both. It's ludicrous to consider yourself a good doctor, a good nurse practitioner, if you're not both promoting health and saying to your patients, hey, you can't live like this anymore. You're eating too much. You're drinking too many sodas that are full of sugar, and you're going to rot out your teeth, etc., etc., etc. We don't need to go down that trail, but you understand my point. But the point is that they both have to encourage you to be healthy, so get exercise, something like that, but also, stop eating yucky stuff. And they go together. And you take that idea anywhere in the modern world, and it makes sense, right? Good teachers try to teach good study habits, but they also try to promote people away from bad habits that take them away from good education. And no good teacher can only do one. You can't just say, you need to be good students and study a lot. And you get students who fall into all sorts of bad habits. So you've got to pull them away from that which is no good and challenge them and cajole them and encourage them into that which is good. In the church, it's the same thing. And you ought not to be surprised, right? Jesus says, in the world, you will have tribulation, so it's not going to be easy. But I want to remind you, before we sort of look at John in earnest, that this is not something that ought to surprise you. Early on in the sort of birthing of the church, Paul speaks to this in a very moving way. And I want to remind you of these words because they have great applicability to John and also therefore to you. This is Paul's last statement to the Ephesian church leadership in Acts chapter 20. So in a sense, it's his last chance. It's always one of the things I think about all the time when I think about Acts 20 is, you get one last address. I mean, supposing you only got one last talk to Christ St. Paul's and you had to move or something, you'd probably think carefully about what you say. It's your parting shot. This is Paul's parting shot. And listen to what he says. This is chapter 20 of Acts, and I'm going to start reading at verse 28. Take heed to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to care for the church of God. Now, he's talking to the leadership of the church in Ephesus. So you can think of it as the vestry, right? So he's talking to maybe a couple of former wardens in the vestry, if you're thinking sort of Anglican Episcopal terms. I know, now verse 29, this is what I'm interested in. I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Now look at this next line. And from among your own selves will arise men speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them. You cannot be surprised about the problems in 1 John if you take what Paul said seriously. He laid the groundwork. It is no surprise. But that is a shocking thing for Paul to say, because it's a little bit different than good and bad medicine in the sense that you tend to think of threats from the outside. This is far more subtle. This is somebody inside the family undermining the family from the inside. And when you're in the family, you get a lot of trust. There's a lot of relationships that already exist, and therefore you have a lot of inherent credibility. So you can do a lot more good, but you can also do a lot more damage. And Paul's language is very clear, isn't it? From among your own selves. And what did John say? They used to be with us, but they've gone out from us, and so they're not really of us because they're no longer with us, and they went away from us. But they were with us. They were members of the family teaching the wrong things. Now, I've said this all my teaching live. I'm going to say it to you right now, but I want it to make a deep impression on you. Don't ever believe anything that anybody says, no matter who they are, as a teacher of the Christian faith, me included. Don't trust teachers and theologians on their own. Learn to be a Berean, if you remember the Bereans in the book of Acts. Go home and check the scriptures. You have a historical faith. You have a prayer book. You have creeds. Just because somebody says it, it's inherently plausible, it sounds good, doesn't mean it's right. You have to learn to be careful as a Christian in terms of thinking through what you believe and what you don't believe, and make sure to be aware that you could be listening to somebody inside the church who's actually leading you away from the church. So this is a tremendous, I think, challenge, perfect for a class like this, in the area of adult education, because to know truth and be able to distinguish truth from error at that level involves a very deep knowledge of the truth and a very subtle ability to use the truth to distinguish between good and error. The other thing I want to say is just to give you a sense of Christian confidence and to remember that Lewis quote. When John says, we've seen it, we've smelled it, we've tasted it, we've touched it, that's the heart of what it means to be a Christian. This is what sets Christianity apart from all other world religions, and it's important to come back to this again and again and again. The light shines in the darkness. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It's a rum thing, that story about the dying God. It really did happen once, and it happened once for all. It's a historical reality, and so we as Christians can have confidence. In Jesus' name, amen.